All right. Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Ashley Lusick, and I am a health educator for community health at Atlantic Health System. Today's webinar, History Discussion, Easter Rebellion in 1916 Dublin, is presented by Robert Steed. Before we begin, I have a few announcements. This webinar is being recorded. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A for questions or chat for comments. We will try and get through all questions at the end of the presentation. Are you or a loved one interested in smoking cessation? Atlantic Health System offers a free quit smoking program. This program includes an individual assessment, free nicotine replacement products, and 6 weekly group meetings to help you quit and stay smoke-free. There are multiple dates and times available, with groups available in person or virtually. For more information about these groups or other resources, or for additional dates and times, please call 1-844-472-8499. I am now going to turn it over to Robert.
I gotta this. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
And everybody can hear it, I guess.
Sounds good.
All right, well, this morning we're going to talk about the Easter uprising, which took place in 1916 in Dublin, Ireland. And there's a number of reasons why this occurred. And I think primarily it was caused by the rise of Irish nationalism. So, there were many factors, many participants, many factions, some pro-British, many that weren't. Probably what's most remembered is the rise of what was called the Irish Parliamentary Party. And it was led at first by Stuart Parnell. And if you go to Dublin today, the main street that runs past the post office is actually Parnell Street, which is named after him. There's actually a monument to him. And he really was leading a movement, a parliamentary movement is the best way to describe it. And he was seeking autonomy from English rule, but not necessarily independence. He was seeking to institute what later became known as the Home Rule Bills, which would grant some level of autonomy to Ireland. It's kind of similar to what took place, which is currently called devolution. You see that in Scotland. They have a lot of independent autonomy, but are still part of Great Britain. He was the leader of this program and made a lot of political connections. He was a member of Parliament. He spent a lot of time in London and was very, very instrumental and played a significant role in pushing this concept. However, he passed away in 1891 without seeing actually a parliamentary home rule bill pass. He was succeeded by John Redmond, and John Redmond was a moderate MP, also sought autonomy, and was perhaps a little bit more politically savvy than Parnell. And he worked closely with British prime ministers to push home rule bills. And he was actually successful in getting the first home rule bill passed, and although there were previous home rule bills that had been defeated. So the home rule parliamentary approach was really staying within the British Empire, staying within the community of England, Wales, Scotland. But it was a rise of Gaelic identity, Irish culture and language, very separate, absolutely separate from the British Isles. The first home rule did pass through the House of Commons in 1886, but it was defeated in the first vote. There'd be a few more years before the second home rule bill was proposed, but it was passed in the House of Commons, but interestingly enough, defeated in the House of Lords. And then the third home rule bill was adopted in September of 1914. And this was a recognition that home rule was going to come to Ireland no matter what. And it was trying to get the best deal possible for both the British and the Irish. However, as soon as it was passed, and unfortunately it passed about the same time that the First World War broke out in August of 1914. So while Parliament allows the passage of the Home Rule Bill, it immediately passed what was called the Suspensory Act of 1914. essentially granting Parliament the power to suspend home rule implementation until the First World War was over. Now, it wasn't thought that the First World War at that point in 1914 would last particularly long. The first suspension was for 1 year, with the ability to update that every 6 months. And in February 1916, an additional 6-month suspension was announced, because by 1916, it was pretty clear that the First War was going to last for quite some time. But there was a lot of discontent within the Irish areas of control, and primarily because of certain things that had occurred in Ireland. Prominently were the Irish Rebellion of 1798, with the increasing British rule, the Act of Union in 1800, which allowed for the absolute English rule in Ireland in all aspects of Irish life, including the dissolution of the Irish Parliament, the elimination of property rights, really the lack of real political representation, and primarily treating the Irish as a second-class group of people. And we'll talk more about that. And it was evidenced by this institutionalized discrimination of the Catholic majority. And you could see it pretty much throughout the major cities in the countryside in Ireland, where you saw rampant disease, abject poverty, lack of education. It really created the seeds of the rebellion. And there was a movement, a growing movement for Irish independence, completely independent of England. In fact, the establishment of an Irish Republic. And then there was the rise of militancy. I mean, it was always in the background, but it became more prominent, especially with the passing of Charles Parnell. The younger parliamentarians of the party and people who were directly affected by the British rule, they really came to the conclusion that the only way to rid themselves of British domination was through insurrection, a militant uprising. The other part of the story is that Home Rule, when it was passed, was adamantly opposed by unionists, Irish unionists. They had an intrinsic status quo involvement in maintaining British rule, both economic and social. They created the first of the parliamentary forces, which it was called the Irish Unionist Protestants created the Ulster Volunteer Force, an armed pro-military force. And in response, Irish nationalists formed both the Irish Volunteers in association with the Irish Brotherhood, which was a kind of an umbrella organization that brought in many different factions of Irish nationalism, often referred to as Irish republicanism. There was another paramilitary unit called the Irish Citizens Army, created by trade unions, especially after the result of trade union industrial action that had occurred in Dublin before the First War, which was violently suppressed by the British Army. So what were the causes here, and what were the basis of Irish nationalist republicanism? It was pretty profound. The Gaelic League, which was founded in 1893, which has a very calming name, was actually promoting the rise of nationalist republicanism and militancy. There was a political wing founded by Arthur Griffith in 1905, and they sought Irish members to withdraw from Parliament in Westminster and London, the establishment of an Irish Parliament, the establishment of an Irish court system, because up until now, Irish citizens, residents of the Irish in Ireland, were subject to British law, revoke the 1800 Act of Union, boycott all British goods and services, and this is sounding a lot like the American Revolution, and there's probably a good reason for that we'll get into. Stop all enlistments in the Royal Navy and the Army, and counter the Ulster Volunteer Force, which is the parliamentary force. They had really become the militant face of the Loyalists. Ian McNeill, he had created the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He was not against an armed insurrection, but only when the time was right. And then with the support from outside of Ireland, primarily the United States. But with the outbreak of the First World War, they turned their attention to Germany. And Germany was more than willing to get involved because it saw an uprising, any kind of rebellion in Ireland as helping their own military efforts down the Western Front. However, because of his reluctance to engage in armed insurrection, he was kind of bypassed by some of the militant leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And they created the Irish Republican Military Council. And they basically kept him in the dark, absolutely not sharing any information about their preparations and plans for an uprising. And it wasn't until just before the Irish uprising took place, actually on Good Friday, that he became aware of it. And the planned kickoff of the rebellion, which was supposed to be marches and parades, which was really a cover to get Irish insurrectionists in place, he made a public appeal to have Irish volunteers not participate. This would play a significant role in limiting the amount of forces available in Dublin and outside of Dublin, like Galway and Wexford and other places, where many Irish volunteers didn't show up. So the Irish Republican Brotherhood Military Council, it was formed in 1915, and its stated purpose was an armed insurrection to overthrow British rule. And it included Patrick Pearse, Joseph Plunkett, Eamon Sinnott, and later members Thomas Clark and Sean McDermott. In January of 1916, they created the Joint Command with the Irish Citizen Army under John Connolly and Thomas McDonough. These 7 members would form the Irish Provisional Government when it was announced on Monday after Easter Sunday. As I said, the Germans were more than happy to lend arms to both sides, because any rebellion or insurrection that tied down British troops and diverted attention away from the Western Front served their purposes. They did supply over 24,000 rifles to the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they provided weapons to the Irish volunteers. There were 2 particular operations being conducted. One was called the Howth Operation, which is the name of the seaport where 900 rifles were landed in 1914, which preceded the First War. And what was called the Labow or Aud Operation, which took place after the First War had broken out, for the delivery of 20,000 rifles and 1 million rounds of ammunition. However, this ship was lost off the Irish coast. It was actually scuttled when it was intercepted by the Royal Navy. And there was a reason that occurred. But here we see the Asgard, which was a private yacht. This was used by the Irish insurrectionists to bring in the first weapons in 1914. And on the right there, you can actually see a picture taken place of them offloading weapons in broad daylight. So it wasn't a big secret. Unfortunately, a lot of these rifles were cast off. They were old and didn't really play that much of a role in arming the rebellion. And this is the Aud. Now, this was a British ship that was interned in Germany when the war broke out. And it was used to transport the weapons that were being brought into Ireland. Unfortunately for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Royal Navy had broken the German code. They were reading the diplomatic codes of the German embassy, especially in Washington. And those messages were being intercepted and decoded. And those messages were headed towards the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which announced the timing and the arrival of the Aud. So needless to say, it wasn't very difficult for the Royal Navy to be waiting for them when they showed up. There was a German captain on this ship. In order to avoid having the ship captured, he intentionally scuttled the ship, which resulted in the loss of all of the weapons on board. There was another member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood who was actually working in Germany at the time. His name was Roger Casement, and he had gone to Germany to negotiate the delivery of weapons. He was really trying to get the German high command to engage in a actual landing of German troops in Ireland. Germans weren't too particularly keen on doing that. In fact, they thought it was kind of a crazy idea. But he did attempt to enlist Irish POWs who were serving in the British Army and had been captured on the Western Front to recruit essentially aid to be landed in Ireland. 1,000 Irish POWs, only about 50 actually decided that they would do that. But they were never able to make it to Ireland to participate. Roger Casement decided to head back to Ireland and essentially tell the leaders of the rebellion that it's probably not a good idea to start because there would be no direct German support. The weapons had been lost. It didn't look like there would be a successful outcome to this. Unfortunately, again, he was brought to Ireland by a German U-boat. And upon landing in Ireland, of course, the British were waiting for him because they knew exactly where he was going to be landing. He was taken prisoner. He was immediately transported to London. And since he was actually a British national, he was actually born in England, he was charged with high treason. He was sentenced to death and he was executed at Pentonville Prison in 1916. So Liberty Hall in Dublin, which was actually a trade unionist building, and it's very hard to see in that black and white picture to the left, but there's a banner there that if you're able to read it, close up, it reads, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser." And this was actually the meeting point for the leaders of the rebellion on Sunday, Easter Sunday. Now, as soon as they met there, they planned on delaying the insurrection for 24 hours because it became clear that they were not going to have the full support of the volunteers that they thought were available. They weren't sure the level of participation. They were still waiting for some forces to enter into Dublin. So the 24-hour delay of the insurrection was put on, and it wouldn't start until the following Monday. Once they left this building, though, it was interesting because the building was left vacant, though the British didn't know that. And as you can see in the picture on the right, the building and the buildings surrounding it were subjected to pretty intense artillery fire. Now, the building today doesn't exist. There is a union building there, a trade union building, but it's a more modern building. But if you go to that corner there, there is a plaque that commemorates the start of the rebellion here at Liberty Hall. So some of the leaders here, I mean, and they came from the different factions. Patrick Pearse was an intellectualist. He was actually a college professor. He was probably the most well-known intellectual leader of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And he really became the face of the rebellion. He was elected president of the Irish Republic at the meeting at Liberty Hall, and also made the commander-in-chief of the Irish Army, which the volunteers and the citizen army were combined and turned into the Irish Army. It would be he who actually, throughout the rebellion, it would be he who actually realized that the rebellion was not going to succeed and issued the unconditional order to surrender the following Saturday. He would be one of the first rebel leaders to be executed by firing squad at Kilmainham Prison on May 3rd, only days after the end of the insurrection. Thomas Clark, on the other hand, who was also a member of the Irish Brotherhood, he clearly was a committed militant insurrectionist from the beginning. He joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood at 18. He was a British citizen. He was born on the Isle of Wight near Southampton and began a career of terrorist bombings, especially in London, where he was actually caught. When he was charged they misspelled his last name. They dropped the E off his name, and they mistook him for another Clark. So although he was sentenced to 15 years in prison at Pentonville, which is the main prison outside of London, and he served that time, they didn't realize that he was actually the leader of the insurrectionist efforts in and around London, and they were bombing railroad stations and bridges and banks. It was pretty extensive. After serving his 15 years, I guess he thought it was a little bit wise to get out of the United Kingdom for a while. And he actually moved to upstate New York, where he became active in Irish politics, raising money for the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And in 1907, returned to Ireland to become an active participant in the upcoming insurrection. He too would be captured and executed at Kilmainham prison. James Connolly, who was the founder of the Irish Citizen Army, was a trade unionist, a former British Army soldier. When he heard of the planning and then the reluctance of the Brotherhood to go forward with the insurrection because of the stand down order that was issued, he's pretty adamant. He said, if you're not going to do it, we'll do it alone. And that probably convinced the rest of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, at least the military faction, to get involved. It didn't take much convincing for Thomas Clark. He was ready to go. So he became the commandant or the leader of the Irish Citizen Army contingent, and actually was announced as the commandant of all Irish Republican forces in Dublin. Here's an interesting person. Probably many people are familiar with him, Eamon de Valera, and not only because he was the only survivor of the insurrection as one of the leaders, and that was primarily because he was also a US citizen. And on the picture on the right there is a picture of Eamon de Valera when he was captured. He was the last of the insurrectionists to surrender, and he didn't surrender until Sunday. That Sunday following the unconditional surrender the previous Saturday. And he was a battalion leader, and he was stationed at Boland's Mill, kept the British from capturing the mill. It was very successful. He too would be incarcerated along with many other leaders, and he would play a prominent role in the Irish Civil War after the First World War. The Irish War of Independence, which took place right after the end of World War I, which resulted in the British leaving Ireland and granting independence, sort of independence. They didn't want to create a republic. They created something called the Irish Free State. He would take up arms against fellow Irishmen, most notably Michael Collins, in the Irish Civil War. He would later become the first president of Ireland and serve as prime minister, and live to enjoy a long life in Irish politics. He died at age 93. The proclamation was issued. It was signed that Sunday in Liberty Hall, and as you can see at the bottom there are the 7 original signers, all of whom would be captured, and when they surrendered, all of whom would be executed. So on Monday, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Irish Army, which included the volunteers and the Citizen Army, captured the government post office on what was then Sackville Street, which is now Parnell Street. And this is an interesting image. I put this up here because they were in uniform, they were armed, and you can see people walking around who hadn't a clue what was going on. It was relatively a unknown event until that Monday, until fighting started to break out. So for the most part, the average citizen was uninvolved and unaware of what was taking place. Needless to say, news of the Irish revolt breaks out pretty quick and spread around the world. This is a newspaper from New York, and it says Irish revolt breaks out in Dublin, rebels seize many parts of town. Well, that was absolutely true. But that second part there on the right, where it says post office is recaptured by the British in hot battle, not true. The GPO would remain in rebel hands up through Friday night, and only because the building caught fire. Otherwise, they were well positioned in the GPO. The GPO still exists today. I've actually been inside it, and it's been rebuilt on the inside, but the exterior is exactly as it was in 1916. So here are the key rebellion sites. It was pretty clear due to the lack of full support from the Irish volunteers, because many just stay at home, although an additional 800 to 900 would filter into Dublin during the week at various points. So the insurrection, the rebellion as it was planned as a military operation, was to essentially block any and all approaches into the center of Dublin by British troops. There were very few British troops actually in Dublin itself. They were mostly stationed outside of Dublin at various barracks. And as you can see here, the black dots, which represent key volunteer strong points, they were all designed to block entry into Dublin itself. And as you can see down there, you see Boland's factory all the way on the right, which was a blocking action along the Northumberland Road area. Boland's factory is where Eamon de Valera was stationed. The British were quick to bring up reinforcements, including a gunboat, the Helga, brought it right up the River Liffey, right to the center of Dublin, and began bombarding the GPO, Liberty Hall, Customs House, and other areas inside the center of Dublin. Now, this is I would think is a stage picture, to be quite honest with you. Although it was taken during the height of the rebellion, but it was clearly in an area that was not under fire by the British, because you can clearly see folks walking around in the background there. If there was any kind of actual fighting taking place, it's highly unlikely people would be walking around on the sidewalks. Well, it's what's interesting here is these guys are either Irish volunteers or members of the Irish Brotherhood, well, certainly all considered part of the Irish Army. They're all using British rifles. So more than likely they had captured these rifles elsewhere, because like I said, most of the weapons that were brought in were antiquated and not really of much use. So these are actually British issued British Lee Enfield rifles. So this is essentially, we'll go through a day-by-day analysis of what took place. It was quite complex, so we're really just going to be going through the highlights here because we could spend quite a bit of time on each day. The proclamation announcing the creation of the Irish Republic, which was signed at Liberty Hall. Thomas Pearce is elected the president, commander-in-chief of the Irish Army. And as I mentioned, the rebellion was delayed 24 hours to Monday. The Irish volunteers and Irish citizen armies units begin deploying in other areas, such as Galway, Wexford, different areas, and there would be fighting that would take place. Some of it significant in other areas outside of Dublin, but that would be a whole nother lecture. We could go into that as well. So the first day of the insurrection takes place on Monday, April 24th. Like I said, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the military command, had moved from Liberty Hall and taken up residence in the GPO, Government Post Office, which would remain the headquarters for the entire insurrection. There was an attack on Dublin Castle, and this really was a result of a failure to have enough troops in place. They didn't have enough troops to actually storm the castle, although the castle had very few British troops in it, and probably with additional forces, they could have captured Dublin Castle. British response was absolutely uncoordinated, and they were thoroughly unprepared. And that's hard to understand because even though the British were reading German codes out of Washington, and Whitehall, and especially the British Admiralty, had informed the British Prime Minister that the insurrection was imminent. They knew it was going to happen. Why that information didn't make it to Dublin or Ireland in particular is still a question that remains unanswered. However, the first casualties start occurring. The British cavalry was sent up Sackville Street, which is Parnell Street, to see what was going on at the government post office. It didn't take long before they learned that the GPO had been taken over by the insurrectionists when they were fired upon. 3 British cavalry troops were killed instantly, and it was pretty clear that an armed insurrection was underway. Sean Connolly, who had helped capture Dublin City Hall, was killed by a British sniper on the same day, same time. He would be the first of many insurrectionists that would be killed during the insurrection. On Tuesday, April 25th, things really start to ramp up. The British government declares martial law, which essentially places all citizens under control of the military. First contingent of British Army regulars start to enter Dublin, and many of them attempting to enter Dublin were met with fierce resistance at those choke points established by the Irish Army. British troops armed with machine guns force Irish volunteers to abandon St. Stephen's Green. If anybody's ever been to Ireland, St. Stephen's Green is this nice little square in this southern part of Dublin. And there's a huge hotel, which is still there today, a 5-star hotel, actually, the Sherborne Hotel. The Irish Republican Army elements of the volunteers captured St. Stephen's Green and dug trenches. All well and good if you were going to fight a surface battle. What the British Army did is they broke into the back of the Sherborne Hotel, went up to the upper floors, including the roof, set up machine guns and brought them under direct machine gun fire, shooting down into them. So they quickly had to abandon St. Stephen's Green. There was a huge rebel force on the north side of Dublin, because Dublin is divided by the river Liffey and 2 canals, the North Canal and the Royal Canal to the north and the south of Dublin. It being pretty clear that the British were not going to stand down, they started bringing in heavy artillery, and it was this indiscriminate use of artillery that would force insurrectionists to withdraw from a number of locations. But it was this indiscriminate use of artillery and machine guns that caused a high number of civilian casualties. People just walking around the street trying to get out of the way were killed or injured by this use of artillery. More troops start arriving from outlying barracks, and more importantly, troops are being transported directly from England across the Irish Sea. By the end of the week, in the space of only 5 days, some 16,000 British troops would be in and around Dublin. The gunboat Helga, which is anchored in the River Liffey, begins a more intensive bombardment of Liberty Hall, which, by the way, was unoccupied. The government post office, City Hall, the Four Courts area, anything within reach. And they were using pretty heavy artillery, 18-pounder artillery, which was pretty effective and destructive. This is a copy of the proclamation of martial law, and it's pretty harsh. Martial law usually is. What's really interesting is the last entry. I don't know if you can actually read it, but it says, all well-disposed persons are hereby warned and advised to keep away from the vicinity of all places where military operations are in progress or where hostile forces are moving, and persons that enter such areas enter at their own risk. And basically it says, in part 2, it says that all persons other than members of His Majesty's forces or police acting in aid of or said forces who are seen carrying arms are liable to be fired upon by the military without warning. And that actually did take place. And the result is that a number of people who weren't even armed were shot and killed by British forces. These were the beginning of British atrocities that would take place in Dublin. although suppressed for a while, they were quite frequent and widespread, which would have a significant impact following the rebellion. On Wednesday, British forces are pretty much fully involved. British artillery is set up at Trinity College. The HMS Helga begins bombardment of Liberty Hall, Boland's Mill, and O'Connell Streets. British forces remaining hold in positions. It was a concept, probably something that they picked up and brought from the Western Front. Just bombard your enemy before sending in the troops. So while the main rebel headquarters was fully occupied in the GPO, there were many reports of survivors of the Irish Republican Brotherhood who said that during Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, there was very little actual shooting taking place because there weren't any troops, British troops, to be seen. However, outlying areas and rebel positions like the Mendacity Institution were captured, which was the first position surrendered by the rebels. And heavy fighting takes place at the Grand Canal and Mount Street Bridge. These were efforts by the British to force entry into an area into central Dublin. And over 240 British reinforcements attempting to cross the bridge became casualties. Quite a number were killed in action. And they weren't able to actually cross the bridge. On Thursday, this is probably the heaviest fighting of the insurrection. There were close quarters fighting, which is essentially house-to-house, door-to-door fighting. There's a huge industrial complex called the South Dublin Union Complex, which is basically encompasses the area, which is also the Guinness Brewery today. The rebels did retain partial control of most of the buildings until Saturday, but it was very, very vicious, close quarters combat in and around the complex. British troops attempt to capture the Marylebone Distillery, but are pushed back and repulsed by Irish Republican Army troops there. Heaviest street fighting of the rebellion takes place in the area around the Four Courts building. Now, Four Courts building is not far from Parnell Street, the main street in Dublin. It's within walking distance, literally, of there. And this is where the heaviest fighting took place. Some of the first British atrocities take place here. 15 unarmed male civilians were shot or bayoneted by British troops. And these people were not involved in the insurrection in any way. But because they looked that they were military age males, that was more than enough for them to be shot or bayoneted by these troops. On Friday, I think it was pretty clear that the insurrection had failed. The GPO building burns as a result of continued artillery bombardment. The British never stopped bombarding that area. James Connolly, who was the Irish Citizen Army commander and the appointed Dublin Brigade commander, is seriously wounded. Thomas Pearce assumes command of the Dublin Brigade. The rebels evacuate and establish a new headquarters by breaking out through the back of the GPO onto Moore Street. If you go to Dublin today and you go past the front of the GPO, you walk down Parnell Street, go up the block, make a quick left, and make another quick left, you're on Moore Street. And right on the corner there is the existing building which the Irish Brotherhood evacuated to. And there is actually a plaque on the building that indicates that this was the last stronghold of the Irish Brotherhood. A breakout had been planned, an attempt to spread out into the surrounding neighborhood, but Thomas Pearce understood that any kind of breakout would only result in more casualties. I think he was fully aware that the British were engaged in indiscriminate use of artillery. There was many reports of civilian casualties being killed or wounded, and I think that played heavily upon him. I mean, he didn't want to actually have an insurrection that resulted in a high number of civilian casualties. But probably the final tipping point in making the decision that it was time to surrender was there was no real prospect of any additional Irish volunteers or citizen army volunteers entering into Dublin, because one of the things that the British had done was, while they were squeezing the area of central Dublin into a smaller area to confine the rebels, they established a pretty strong ring of exclusion around Dublin. So it was almost impossible to enter into Dublin or exit from Dublin from the outlying areas. This is a classic painting that was done obviously after the rebellion. There was no actual photography during the rebellion inside the GPO, but here we see the building's on fire. You have some nurses there, and most of the members of the IRB are there. And on the stretcher there, in the hands of a nurse, is Connolly, and you can see he's wounded there. He was unable to walk. He's being asked what the orders are. Thomas Pierce is there in the brown jacket taking notes, and it basically he's saying, I think, the time has come to evacuate, to get out. Thomas Pierce is told that he's to take over leadership of the forces, of the insurrectionist forces, and this is where they plan their breakout. On Saturday, April 29th, the heavy casualties caused by indiscriminate artillery, it finally convinces Pierce to order a ceasefire. Pierce surrenders all rebel forces unconditionally to General Lowe, who was the British military commander in Dublin at that time. Although sporadic fighting would occur until Sunday, and that included Eamon de Valera and his Irish volunteers at Boland's factory. General Maxwell arrives from London and immediately assumes command of all British forces in and around Dublin. And he brings with him the concept of brutal retribution to be meted out to all of the insurrectionists. These are British troops. Again, this is probably a staged picture because I don't think there were any photographers roaming around with bullets flying in a city setting. But here you can see they've established a barricade of beer barrels, no shortage of beer barrels in Dublin, and basically keeping Irish volunteers under fire here. And this is the actual British encirclement plan. And you can see what they've done is they've cut off central Dublin from anywhere else in Ireland. Impossible to get in, and then just squeeze that circle tighter and tighter. This is the aftermath. This is one picture, Dublin city center. And what you can see here is the destruction caused by the heavy artillery that the British were using here. And buildings were basically leveled. Looked like something out of World War II, literally leveled the city. In certain parts of it, at least, essentially in and around Parnell Street, or Sackville Street, as it was called, and the area around the Four Courts and the Customs Building along, especially along the River Liffey. If you go to Dublin today, most of the buildings along the River Liffey are new because most of the buildings there were destroyed or burnt to the ground. So John Maxwell arrives, takes command of Dublin forces. He orders a brutal suppression of the rebellion, including summary executions and continent, just basically outright murder of civilians and rebels alike. The British Army had actually engaged in what could only be classified as murder. Some British officers were appalled by some of the action that took place, reported it to their superiors, to no avail, unfortunately. One of the things that Maxwell orders is mass arrests and summary court-martials to be undertaken. And interestingly enough, some of these court-martials would be chaired by British officers who had actually fought in in the rebellion, against the rebellion, which is contrary to British military policy. It was clear that even in London, Prime Minister was becoming well aware of that this brutality would not result in any kind of long-term peace, certainly would only encourage active insurrection somewhere down the line. And he was absolutely, the Prime Minister was absolutely correct. And there was a lot of American pressure to stop the actions that were taking place. But it was the actions of General Maxwell and the ensuing weeks that followed the rebellion that, even though there wasn't widespread average citizen support for the rebellion when it broke out, when it became clear of the brutal suppression that had taken place, the summary executions, murder essentially, really turned populace against the British. It clear, as long as the British were going to remain in Ireland, there would be no real peace in Ireland. All of the executions took place at Kilmainham Prison. Kilmainham Prison is still in existence today, although it is not a prison. It's a memorial site. Like I said, there were a number of summary court-martials. Almost 3,500 people were arrested for one reason or another, or for no reason. 187 were tried in secret tribunals. They were not allowed a defense. Of those tried, 90 were sentenced to death. And the death penalty was to be execution by firing squad. General Maxwell himself signed the execution orders for 14 of those 90. The remainder were commuted to life in prison sentences. The 14 were executed. If you go to Kilmainham Prison, take the tour, it'll take you through the prison itself. And when you come out through the back of the prison, this is where the executions by firing squad took place. And there is a cross there that memorializes that it took place there. All 7 signers of the Proclamation of Independence were executed here. And even Connolly, who was unable to walk because he had been shot through the ankle, his execution was not deferred. They literally strapped him to a chair, brought him out, and put him in front of the firing squad, and he was executed by the firing squad sitting in a chair. It became pretty clear that something had to be done, and orders came down from London to stop the executions. That's not to say that the British government wasn't going to take the action necessary that they thought to suppress any additional uprisings. All of the original signers of the proclamation were taken from Kilmainham Prison and taken to Arbor Hill, which was a military prison, and were buried in an unmarked mass grave. It has since become a memorial site. All of the people who participated in the insurrection, volunteers, Irish Citizen Army, citizens who lost their lives through no fault of their own, they're memorialized on the wall in the back. But here is the actual internment of the 7 signers of the proclamation, which included Thomas Clark, James Connolly, Patrick Pearse, Sean D'Amata, Joseph Plunkett, Eamon Seenet, and Thomas McDonough. It is a very somber place. It's kind of off the beaten path. You have to look for it to get there. And the reason they were buried there is because the British didn't want to create any memorial to the uprising, essentially. So as we know, the government post office burnt to the ground. The exterior of the building remained, but the interior was completely gutted. And this is a picture taken right after the insurrection. You can see the devastation here. But the building itself was rebuilt. This is the post office today. It is the exact same exterior. You can go in there and do any kind of business you want with the post office. I actually mail postcards home from there. But the columns are very interesting. If you walk up closely and take a close look, you can see signs of the damage from the rebellion. These are bullet holes in some of the columns, and the columns are chipped from machine gun fire. Very, very common to see. All of the columns are damaged to some extent. The Irish Republic flag, which was actually created by a woman in the GPO at the height of the rebellion, was captured by the British. This is the actual flag itself, the remnants of it. This is a picture of British Army officers posing with the Irish Republic flag. It was immediately sent to London, where it was kept. And it was only returned in 1966 to mark the 50th anniversary of the uprising. And it is a kind of like the Declaration of Independence. It is a sacred artifact of the Irish Republic today. Captured IRA forces. This is some of the pictures taken here. British Army troops escorting presumably Irish forces. It's quite possible that these are innocent civilians being rounded up by British troops. It was interesting that, in some areas of Dublin, the insurrectionists were jeered at by members of the public, and probably because they understood, there would be a disruption in food supplies, the destruction of housing, obviously widespread understanding that there would be British retribution. So it took a while for the public to come around to understanding exactly what they were trying to accomplish. The picture on the left there, you can see, and this is actually crossing, this is on Parnell Street as you cross over the River Liffey. And in the background there, that's the north side of Dublin. That's actually the customs house that was burned to the ground and bombarded by the gunboat Helga, which was right, to the right of the bridge here. So what happened to those who were interred? Actually, the Irish Republicans were taken into custody, about 1,800 of them actually, and they were sent to Wales. And they were sent to the Fongok internment camp in Wales, which was prior to World War I, was a distillery. It went bankrupt. It was turned into a German POW camp for a while. But once they understood that they needed a place to send the majority of the insurrectionists, German POWs were cleared out. And this is a picture on the left of the first arrival of Irish Republican Army members or volunteers. This is a picture of the exterior of the building. It's since been dismantled. It's an open field today. There is a marker there that commemorates the prison. What's interesting is some of the ultimate leaders of the Irish War of Independence, which broke out after the First War, which is fought against the British, and Irish leaders in the Irish Civil War, which was a war fought between anti-treaty and treaty factions within Ireland, those who supported the Irish Free State and basically the separation of Northern Ireland, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, not granting full independence. That faction was led by Michael Collins, and the anti-treaty faction, which was led by Eamon de Valera, which fought against that, and he was for establishment of an independent Irish Republic, completely independent of England. It's interesting that Michael Collins and these guys were interred there. The interment was for until December of 1916. It wasn't like Michael Collins was just whiling away his time there, relaxing and taking in the surrounding area, because they were actually free to roam around in the area around the camp because it was such an isolated area. And their guards were basically elderly home guard folks who were probably somewhat sympathetic to the Irish cause. But Michael Collins created the structure for the Irish Republican Army and the command structure while he was at this camp and actually conducted classes on military tactics and guerrilla warfare. Actually held numerous classes. And eventually, as it's still referred to today, this is known as the University of Revolution, where most of the leaders in the upcoming conflict after the First War spent their time learning their trade. The camp itself was closed in December of 1916. All of the internees were returned to Dublin, which really marked the occasion where the public turned out to welcome them back as heroes. It became clear, I think it was pretty obvious to the British that following World War I, they were not going to be able to hold on to Ireland. There was a rise of Irish nationalism, widespread throughout through Ireland. The conflict between loyalists who were loyal to the crown and nationalists who were promoting Irish independence became more pronounced. It was clear that there would be more violence in the future of Ireland. And I think the British were well aware of what was taking place, but they had their hands full. They were still fighting the First World War. But after the First World War in 1918, it didn't take long for armed insurrection to break out again. And again, here you had the British Army fighting rebel insurrectionists throughout Ireland. It was open warfare. The British, once again, probably to their detriment, not understanding that there was a better way to approach this, created some pretty violent groups to undertake this combat, most notably a group called the Black and Tans, which were hardcore veterans of the British Army that served in the Western Front, probably all suffering from PTSD to one extent or another, were brutal, extremely brutal. Even their British officers feared them. The interesting thing is they were called the Black and Tans because the British Army didn't have enough uniforms, complete uniforms, to outfit this group. So their tunics were tan and their pants were black, hence Black and Tans. What was the human toll here? Like every conflict, there's a human cost. Irish rebel forces suffered 64 killed, 16 were executed. Of course, the 7 signers of the proclamation and other members who were executed, not in Kilmainham, but other areas of Dublin. British Army lost 132 troops killed, 397 wounded. But the most significant casualties, as usual, were Irish civilians. 254 were killed and over 2,200 were wounded, some quite seriously. The total number of killed were 466 and 2,614 were wounded. What was the aftermath? Well, 3,430 men and 79 women were arrested. Brutal suppression of the uprising creates public outrage, not only in Ireland, but in England as well, not to mention the United States. 14 rebels were summarily executed within days at Kilmainham prison. 97 others were condemned to death, but their sentences were later commuted to prison terms. The self-sacrifice and bravery of the rebels promotes nationalism, which was not quite evident right after the rebellion. But once British atrocities and the brutality that followed the rebellion became more widespread and well known, it really played into the hands of the nationalists. Most importantly, probably, was that British rule was no longer considered unchallengeable. Up until this time, it was like most of the people couldn't imagine that the British could be overthrown. The 2,000 interned rebels are returned to Ireland, and they take up the cause of independence. The Irish Republican Army is reformed. Sinn Féin, which is the political wing of the independence movement, gains widespread support. And in the first elections held after the First War, they became the dominant party in the Irish Republic. So that's essentially the overview of the rebellion. I guess we could say that the rebellion was both a failure and a success, just not at the same time. The rebellion set the basis for the future independence of Ireland, the complete independence of Ireland from England. It still remains the object of Sinn Féin, which is the major party in Ireland today. And interestingly enough, in the last elections in Northern Ireland, which is a predominantly Protestant loyalist stronghold and has been since the separation of Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It's interesting that in the last election held 2 years ago, that Sinn Féin won the majority of seats in Stormont, which is the parliament in Northern Ireland. The stated goal of Sinn Féin has been and continues to be the reunification of Northern Ireland with the Republic. As to whether that'll happen anytime soon, it's hard to say. I mean, Brexit is playing a big role in a reconsideration of rejoining the Republic. The Republic is the European Community and join the benefits of being in the EU. When the Brexit vote was held, it's interestingly enough that Northern Ireland, both Protestant and Catholics, loyalists and nationalists or Republicans, voted in an overwhelming majority to remain in the European community. So if you follow Brexit, there's a thing called the protocol, which essentially Northern Ireland continues to trade with the European community, but there are no hard borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but there has to be a hard border between goods coming from the United Kingdom because they've left the EU. So it's been a very contentious issue. Prime Minister Sunak has worked out a deal, kind of mitigating some of the issues that keeps Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, but yet still a part of the European Union. So essentially, in a nutshell, it's a story that's yet to finish. It's probably an issue that still has to be dealt with. I think probably one of the other issues is the decline of religion in Northern Ireland and certainly in the Republic. The Catholic Church no longer has the level of control, of political power that it used to have. And I don't think the Church of England, which is the Protestant Church of England in Northern Ireland, has that as well. I think a lot of people are putting aside religious indifference. And probably that's a good thing because it's been a causative factor, a lot of the violence, especially in the Troubles in the 80s and the 90s. And the Good Friday Agreement, which will be celebrated tomorrow. President Biden will be in Ireland for that. It's an ongoing story. And like I said, I think that there's a future here that hasn't been decided yet. So with that, if anybody has a question, I'd be more than happy to spend as much time as you want. Hope you all learned a little bit about the Irish Rebellion. It is a more complex story than we've just talked about. 45 minutes is not enough to deal with it. You could probably spend 2 hours on each of the days of the rebellion itself, but that's probably for a different forum. So if there's any questions.
So I'd like to take this opportunity to say to everyone, thank you today for joining. We kindly ask if you can take a few minutes after today's webinar to complete the program survey. The link to the survey has also been added to the chat for your convenience. I'd like to say a special thank you for Robert for sharing your expertise today, and also thank you for sharing your personal ties to this. That was quite fascinating. If anyone has any additional questions or comments, you can send an email to communityhealth@atlantichealth.org or by calling 1-844-472-8499. And I believe that concludes today's. Sorry.
Well, I think I'll be back sometime in August, right?
Yes. And I believe we do have it posted online at this time. If anyone looks, we have another presentation on Operation Tidal Wave in August.
Yes. I was actually there, so not my father was there in World War II, and I went many years later.
Oh, wow.
We'll talk about that in August.
Yeah. So with that being said, I think that concludes today's webinar. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you again to Robert.
Bye.
Bye-bye.